What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Henry VIII's love life was worse than Charles II. Charles II of England, the so-called Merry Monarch, had a legendary love life. His mistresses were visible, integral members of his court. Stories of their affairs with the king, and their rivalries with each other, have echoed through the centuries. Born in 1630, Charles spent much of his young adulthood in exile. In 1649, Charles I, his father, was removed from power and put to death. While a puritanical regime ruled over England, Charles bided his time on the continent. In 1661, Charles was invited home by England's Parliament to become king. This restoration of the monarchy marked the beginning of a new era in English history. During his 25 years as king, Charles accomplished a few things. He opened theaters in London and supported the Royal Society for Scientific Research as a patron of the arts and sciences. Charles, on the other hand, is best known for having a love life that was even more insane than Henry VIII. While, like Charles, Henry had several mistresses, it was his multiple marriages that brought him infamy. Henry ended his marriages as quickly as he rushed into them. He was as likely to divorce a wife as execute one. Much of Henry's bedroom politics increasingly focused on his desire to produce a male heir, though his poor health slowed him down in his later years. If Henry VIII's love life was deadly, Charles II was bawdy. He never let marriage get in the way of a good affair. A prolific adulterer, Charles freely engaged in colorful public liaisons with a string of women. These mistresses came from all kinds of backgrounds and were well known by courtiers and commoners alike. They were often at the center of court politics and managed intrigues of their own. He never fathered a legitimate child but had over a dozen illegitimate ones. Though Charles was married to Catherine of Braganza, the marriage never produced any children. Much to her dismay, Catherine had several pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. Charles fathered several illegitimate children, however. Charles financially supported and adored them, despite the fact that historians disagree on the precise number. He may have had 16 or more. Charles's lack of legitimate heirs meant that his younger brother James succeeded him to the throne in 1685. One mistress was a French spy Charles nicknamed Phobs. Born into the French nobility, Louise de Keroualle first came to England in 1670 as part of Charles II's sister's entourage. Charles soon became infatuated with her and installed her as his mistress. Louise, like many of Charles's other mistresses, was aware that her connection to the king was ultimately one of politics. In fact, she was a French spy. She was part of a direct line of information via the French ambassador to King Louis XIV of France. By all accounts, Charles was genuinely attached to Louise and admitted, "'Tis impossible to express the true passion and kindness I have for my dearest Phobs." He referred to her as Phobs, as a way to refer to her. Charles passed away while Louise remained by his side. Charles had a servant who was known as his Pimpmaster. As the King of England and Scotland, Charles II had a servant for everything, even for procuring female company. William Chiffinch was officially in charge of Charles's bedroom. Informally, however, he was known as the King's Pimpmaster General. Chiffinch recruited potential mistresses for Charles. He didn't just recruit well-connected noblewomen. He also recruited women from all walks of life in London. Barbara Palmer, nicknamed the Uncrowned Queen, insisted on birthing Charles's illegitimate child in a palace. One of Charles's most controversial mistresses was Barbara Palmer, the Duchess of Cleveland and the Countess of Castlemaine, who adored all the trappings, wealth, and privileges that came with her position. Nicknamed the Uncrowned Queen, Palmer wasn't above throwing her weight around court. When Charles married Catherine of Braganza in 1662, Palmer displayed her undergarments at Whitehall Palace. This act demonstrated, in the words of historic royal palaces, how Palmer was not only objecting to the marriage but making a claim of ownership over Charles and the court, as the publication puts it. Palmer went out of her way to assert her authority. Palmer insisted that she give birth to one of Charles's unborn children at Hampton Court Palace, one of the royal estates. Many resented Barbara Palmer's influence over Charles. According to court diarist Samuel Pepys, Palmer rules him, who, he says, hath all the tricks of artin that are to be practiced to give pleasure. Nell Gwynn once outmaneuvered a rival mistress by slipping her a laxative. Using a laxative, Nell Gwynn once outwitted a rival mistress. Charles II often maintained several mistresses at once. As they attempted to outmaneuver one another for the king's attention and favor, this occasionally stoked rivalries between them. According to one legend, Nell Gwynn went to great lengths to prevent Charles from having a relationship with Moll Davis, another royal mistress. Before Davis was supposed to have a rendezvous with the king, Gwynn added a laxative to Davis's meal, thus making her indisposed for the remainder of the night. It's possible that Charles's first love was his former nurse. Charles was 14 years old when he may have taken his first lover, Christabella Wyndham. Wyndham wasn't just any lady of the court. She had an intimate connection with Charles. She had served as his nurse when he was a baby. The fact that Wyndham had nursed the young prince did not seem to dissuade the couple, however. He was attracted to actresses. Charles II reopened theaters that had been closed since 1642 when he took the throne in 1660. The revival of English theaters also brought something new: professional actresses who had previously been banned from performing on stage. At least two of Charles's mistresses were actresses. As a stage performer, Nell Gwynn was already well known before she became a royal mistress. Charles's affair with Moll Davis, pictured at right, another actress, brought her considerable wealth too. Charles persuaded his wife to take his mistress' place. In 1662, Charles married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. Unfortunately for Catherine, Charles was already several years into an affair with Barbara Palmer, Lady Castlemaine. Charles was so devoted to Palmer that he once quipped, "Whosoever I find to be my Lady Castlemaine's enemy, I do promise upon my word to be his enemy so long as I live." Queens were apparently no exception to this mandate. Charles expected his new wife to accept his affairs, and the couple entered into a marital fight that spilled over into the court. Charles ultimately won. He appointed Palmer as a lady of the bedchamber to Catherine, blatantly ignoring the Queen's fierce objections. Catherine was so scandalized when Palmer was presented to her that she passed out. Despite his frequent affairs, the failure to produce a legitimate heir, and the advice of others, Charles never attempted to divorce Catherine. Hortense Mancini may have had an affair with Charles's illegitimate daughter too. Roman-born Hortense Mancini, a niece of Cardinal Mazarin and member of the so-called Mazarinettes, was a short-lived mistress of Charles. However, she was not only in a romantic relationship with Charles but also with other members of his family. Mancini and Anne Leonard, Countess of Sussex, one of Charles's illegitimate children with Barbara Palmer, may have had their own affair. The young married Countess Sussex was sent to a French convent because she wanted to stay with Mancini rather than her husband. Mistresses frequently fought with one another and competed for court influence. Charles II lavished gifts on his mistresses. In other words, being a royal mistress was an incredibly lucrative business. His mistress Barbara Palmer even had access to the privy purse, and he gamely settled her significant debts. Due to the power, wealth, and privilege that came with serving as a royal mistress, women often jockeyed with one another to win Charles's attention and affection. Nell Gwynn, one of Charles's favorite mistresses, became a folk hero. Actress-turned-mistress Nell Gwynn was different from a lot of Charles's other paramours. She was a product of the streets of London. But she won over king and kingdom alike with her plucky attitude, wit, and all-around good humor. Diarist Samuel Pepys even lovingly referred to her as pretty, witty Nell. Commoners, in particular, celebrated Gwynn. To them she was, as historian Leslie Carroll put it, the goddess of the gutter snipes, and a bona fide celebrity. After a London crowd had mistaken her for another royal mistress, Louise de Keroualle, a French Catholic, her response drew their cheers. "Pray good people be civil, I am the Protestant **re. Some courtiers tried to leverage power by supplanting Charles's mistresses and installing their own. Without a doubt, the royal bed was a political space. As a result, royal mistresses potentially wielded tremendous influence. Some courtiers and officials tried to leverage power by being sure that the right women had the king's ear. Ralph Montague, an ambassador to France, attempted to usurp Barbara Palmer as the king's mistress by making Hortense Mancini the king's lover. Palmer, in turn, consolidated her own influence over Charles by introducing him to other potential lovers, especially ones that she could control. While Henry VIII is perhaps more famous for his deadly obsession with matrimony, divorces, and decapitations in pursuit of a male heir, it is Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, whose love life was far more indulgent, flamboyant, and openly scandalous, embodying a reckless kind of libertinism that was unprecedented among English monarchs and has arguably never been matched since. Born in 1630 into a turbulent time, Charles's early years were marked by political chaos as his father, Charles I, struggled to maintain monarchical authority during the rise of parliamentarian forces in the English Civil War. Charles lived in exile across Europe after his father was executed in 1649, which shocked Europe and signaled the temporary end of the English monarchy. He moved between France and the Netherlands and relied on the generosity of foreign courts. His formative years abroad exposed him to the opulent and sensual courts of Louis XIV and other continental monarchs, and these experiences deeply shaped his worldview, especially when it came to court culture, women, and power. Charles returned triumphantly to England as king when the monarchy was restored in 1660 following Oliver Cromwell's death, and the demise of the short-lived English Commonwealth. This marked the beginning of the Restoration period, which saw unprecedented cultural flowering, theater, science, and political intrigue. But if the Restoration is remembered for anything, it's the libertine spirit that Charles championed, turning the stiff, Puritan-dominated England into a decadent playground of pleasures where mistresses, actresses, and secret trysts were just another part of court life. Unlike Henry VIII, whose personal life was largely defined by political marriages and brutal endings for his wives, Charles II seemed to make no effort to pretend his sexual liaisons were anything but what they were: recreational, unrepentant, and often strategic. Though married to Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess who failed to produce an heir despite several heartbreaking miscarriages, Charles showed neither anger nor impatience toward his wife. Instead, he turned his full attention to his many mistresses, whom he publicly supported, ennobled, and even housed at royal estates. These women were honored, depicted, written about, and even used as pawns in the political theater of royal power. They were not hidden or shamed. They were actresses, noblewomen, spies, and others who played roles in the intricate court drama that shaped Charles's 25-year reign. One of his earliest and most powerful mistresses, Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland, was so brazen in her influence that she became known as the uncrowned queen. Fiercely ambitious, Barbara did not merely accept her position at court, she demanded recognition. When Charles married Catherine of Braganza, Barbara, unfazed, made a show of displaying her undergarments in the palace as a declaration of her dominance, mocking the new queen and staking her claim on the king. Her authority was so pronounced that Charles eventually forced his queen to accept Barbara into her royal household, naming her a lady of the bedchamber despite Catherine's protests, which culminated in a fainting episode when Barbara was formally introduced. Palmer bore the king several illegitimate children, at least 5, and was given vast estates and titles. She also exerted immense political influence, and her presence scandalized both courtiers and the public, but Charles remained unapologetically loyal. Another favorite, Nell Gwynn, was the charming and quick-witted actress who captivated London theatergoers before stealing the king's heart. Unlike many mistresses, Nell came from humble origins, having been raised in poverty, but her cleverness and beauty propelled her into the king's inner circle. She famously referred to herself as the Protestant whore, distinguishing herself from Charles's other mistress Louise de Keroualle, a Catholic and suspected French agent. To prevent Moll Davis from spending the night with Charles, Nell infamously laced Moll Davis's dinner with a laxative. Nell was not above using tricks to win in court. While Nell enjoyed an evening of royal favor, Davis, another actress who became a mistress, reportedly missed her rendezvous. Gwynn's charisma and sense of humor made her beloved by the people, and she bore Charles 2 sons, one of whom was made Duke of St. Albans. Then there was Louise de Keroualle, a refined French noblewoman who traveled to England with Charles's sister, Henrietta of Orleans. She impressed the king immediately with her poise and gentle demeanor. But Louise had secrets. She was also a spy for King Louis XIV, and her pillow talk with Charles often made its way back to the French court. Despite this, Charles seemed genuinely fond of her, affectionately calling her Phubs, and kept her close until his death. She was deeply unpopular in the English public due to her foreign status and Catholic faith, but Charles stood by her and gave her a dukedom and lavished her with wealth. His sexual appetite was legendary and spanned social classes. Charles was said to be insatiable, and he delegated even his intimate affairs to trusted courtiers. William Chiffinch, his chief page and bedchamber officer, was nicknamed the Pimpmaster General for his role in procuring women for the king, whether they were noble ladies, actresses, or women plucked from the bustling streets of London. Charles had many such dalliances, and while not all were politically significant, many produced children whom he acknowledged and supported. In fact, Charles fathered over a dozen illegitimate children, and though he never had a legitimate heir with Catherine, he took pride in his many offspring, often elevating them to noble ranks and using them to secure alliances within the aristocracy. One of his most powerful illegitimate sons, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, was considered by many to be the king's favorite. So favored was he that rumors circulated suggesting Charles might declare him legitimate.